KaraokeBooks.
In Search of Lost Time. Swann's Way. Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K.Scott-Moncrieff. The name of Boiseville had suggested to him that of another place in the same district, Buesville, which carried also, bound to it by a hyphen, a second name, de wit Breaute, which he had often seen on maps, but without ever previously remarking that it was the same name as that borne by his friend M. de Breaute, whom the anonymous letter accused of having been Odette's lover. After all, when it came to M. de Breaute, there was nothing improbable in the charge, but so far as me. Verdurin was concerned, it was a sheer impossibility. From the fact that Odette did occasionally tell a lie, it was not fair to conclude that she never, by any chance, told the truth, and in these bantering conversations with me, Verdurin, which she herself had repeated to Swann, he could recognize those meaningless and dangerous pleasantries which, in their inexperience of life and ignorance of vice, women often utter, thereby certifying their own innocence, who, as, for instance, Odette, would be the last people in the world to feel any undue affection for one another. Whereas, on the other hand, the indignation with which she had scattered the suspicions which she had unintentionally brought into being, for a moment, in his mind by her story, fitted in with everything that he knew of the tastes, the temperament of his mistress. But at that moment, by an inspiration of jealousy, analogous to the inspiration which reveals to a poet or a philosopher, who has nothing, so far, but an odd pair of rhymes or a detached observation, the idea or the natural law which will give power, mastery to his work, Swann recalled for the first time a remark which Odette had made to him, at least 2 years before. "Oh, me. Verdurin, she won't hear of anything just now but me. I'm a love, if you please, and she kisses me, and wants me to go with her everywhere, and call her by her Christian name." So far from seeing in these expressions any connection with the absurd insinuations, intended to create an atmosphere of vice, which Odette had since repeated to him, he had welcomed them as a proof of me. Verdurin's warm-hearted and generous friendship. But now this old memory of her affection for Odette had coalesced suddenly with his more recent memory of her unseemly conversation. He could no longer separate them in his mind, and he saw them blended in reality, the affection imparting a certain seriousness and importance to the pleasantries which, in return, spoiled the affection of its innocence. He went to see Odette. He sat down, keeping at a distance from her. He did not dare to embrace her, not knowing whether in her, in himself, it would be affection or anger that a kiss would provoke. He sat there silent, watching their love expire. Suddenly he made up his mind. "Odette, my darling," he began, "I know, I am being simply odious, but I must ask you a few questions. You remember what I once thought about you and me. Verdurin? Tell me, was it true? Have you, with her or anyone else, ever?" She shook her head, pursing her lips together. A sign which people commonly employ to signify that they are not going, because it would bore them to go, when someone has asked, "Are you coming to watch the procession go by?" Or, "Will you be at the review?" But this shake of the head, which is thus commonly used to decline participation in an event that has yet to come, imparts for that reason an element of uncertainty to the denial of participation in an event that is past. Furthermore, it suggests reasons of personal convenience, rather than any definite repudiation, any moral impossibility. When he saw Odette thus make him a sign that the insinuation was false, he realized that it was quite possibly true. "I have told you, I never did. You know quite well," she added, seeming angry and uncomfortable. "Yes, I know all that, but are you quite sure? Don't say to me, you know quite well, say, I have never done anything of that sort with any woman." She repeated his words like a lesson learned by rote, and as though she hoped, thereby, to be rid of him. "I have never done anything of that sort with any woman. Can you swear it to me on your legato medal?" Swann knew that Odette would never perjure herself on that. "Oh, you do make me so miserable," she cried, with a jerk of her body as though to shake herself free of the constraint of his question. "Have you nearly done?" What is the matter with you today? You seem to have made up your mind that I am to be forced to hate you, to curse you. Look, I was anxious to be friends with you again, for us to have a nice time together, like the old days, and this is all the thanks I get." However, he would not let her go, but sat there like a surgeon who waits for a spasm to subside that has interrupted his operation but need not make him abandon it. "You are quite wrong in supposing that I bear you the least ill will in the world, Odette," he began with a persuasive and deceitful gentleness. "I never speak to you except of what I already know, and I always know a great deal more than I say. But you alone can mollify by your confession what makes me hate you so long as it has been reported to me only by other people. My anger with you is never due to your actions. I can and do forgive you everything because I love you. But to your untruthfulness, the ridiculous untruthfulness which makes you persist in denying things which I know to be true. How can you expect that I shall continue to love you, when I see you maintain, when I hear you swear to me a thing which I know to be false? Odette, do not prolong this moment which is torturing us both. If you are willing to end it at once, you shall be free of it forever. Tell me, upon your medal, yes or no, whether you have ever done those things." "How on earth can I tell?" She was furious. "Perhaps I have, ever so long ago, when I didn't know what I was doing, perhaps 2 or 3 times. Swann had prepared himself for all possibilities. Reality must, therefore, be something which bears no relation to possibilities, any more than the stab of a knife in one's body bears to the gradual movement of the clouds overhead, since those words, 2 or 3 times, carved, as it were, a cross upon the living tissues of his heart. A strange thing, indeed, that those words, 2 or 3 times, nothing more than a few words, words uttered in the air, at a distance, could so lacerate a man's heart, as if they had actually pierced it, could sicken a man, like a poison that he had drunk. Instinctively Swann thought of the remark that he had heard at me. De Saint Euvert's. I have never seen anything to beat it since the table turning. The agony that he now suffered in no way resembled what he had supposed. Not only because, in the hours when he most entirely mistrusted her, he had rarely imagined such a culmination of evil, but because, even when he did imagine that offense, it remained vague, uncertain, was not clothed in the particular horror which had escaped with the words, perhaps 2 or 3 times, was not armed with that specific cruelty, as different from anything that he had known as a new malady by which one is attacked for the first time. And yet this Odette, from whom all this evil sprang, was no less dear to him, was, on the contrary, more precious, as if, in proportion as his sufferings increased, there increased at the same time the price of the sedative, of the antidote which this woman alone possessed. He wished to pay her more attention, as one attends to a disease which one discovers, suddenly, to have grown more serious. He wished that the horrible thing which, she had told him, she had done 2 or 3 times, might be prevented from occurring again. To ensure that, he must watch over Odette. People often say that, by pointing out to a man the faults of his mistress, you succeed only in strengthening his attachment to her, because he does not believe you. Yet how much more so if he does? But, Swann asked himself, how could he manage to protect her? He might perhaps be able to preserve her from the contamination of any one woman, but there were hundreds of other women. And he realized how insane had been his ambition when he had begun, on the evening when he had failed to find Odette at the Verdurins, to desire the possession, as if that were ever possible, of another person. Happily for Swann, beneath the mass of suffering which had invaded his soul like a conquering horde of barbarians, there lay a natural foundation, older, more placid, and silently laborious, like the cells of an injured organ which at once set to work to repair the damaged tissues, or the muscles of a paralyzed limb which tend to recover their former movements. These autochthonous indwellers in his soul absorbed all Swann's strength, for a while, in that obscure task of reparation which gives one an illusory sense of repose during convalescence, or after an operation. This time it was not so much, as it ordinarily was, in Swann's brain that the slackening of tension due to exhaustion took effect, it was rather in his heart. But all the things in life that have once existed tend to recur, and, like a dying animal that is once more stirred by the throes of a convulsion which was, apparently, ended, upon Swann's heart, spared for a moment only, the same agony returned of its own accord to trace the same cross again. He remembered those moonlit evenings when, leaning back in the Victoria that was taking him to the Rue La Pérouse, he would cultivate with voluptuous enjoyment the emotions of a man in love, ignorant of the poisoned fruit that such emotions must inevitably bear. But all those thoughts lasted for no more than a second, the time that it took him to raise his hand to his heart, to draw breath again and to contrive to smile, so as to dissemble his torment. Already he had begun to put further questions. For his jealousy, which had taken an amount of trouble, such as no enemy would have incurred, to strike him this mortal blow, to make him forcibly acquainted with the most cruel pain that he had ever known, his jealousy was not satisfied that he had yet suffered enough, and sought to expose his bosom to an even deeper wound. Like an evil deity, his jealousy was inspiring Swann, was thrusting him on towards destruction. It was not his fault, but Odette's alone, if at first his punishment was not more severe. "My darling," he began again, "it's all over now. Was it with anyone I know?" "No, I swear it wasn't. Besides, I think I exaggerated. I never really went as far as that." He smiled, and resumed with, "Just as you like. It doesn't really matter, but it's unfortunate that you can't give me any name. If I were able to form an idea of the person that would prevent my ever thinking of her again. I say it for your own sake, because then I shouldn't bother you any more about it. It's so soothing to be able to form a clear picture of things in one's mind. What is really terrible is what one cannot imagine. But you've been so sweet to me, I don't want to tire you. I do thank you, with all my heart, for all the good that you have done me. I've quite finished now. Only one word more. How many times? Oh, Charles. Can't you see, you're killing me? It's all ever so long ago. I've never given it a thought. Anyone would say that you were positively trying to put those ideas into my head again. And then you'd be a lot better off," she concluded, with unconscious stupidity but with intentional malice. "I only wished to know whether it had been since I knew you. It's only natural. Did it happen here, ever? You can't give me any particular evening, so that I can remind myself what I was doing at the time? You understand, surely, that it's not possible that you don't remember with whom, Odette, my love. But I don't know, really, I don't. I think it was in the Bois, one evening when you came to meet us on the island. You had been dining with the Princesse des Lames," she added, happy to be able to furnish him with an exact detail, which testified to her veracity. "At the next table there was a woman whom I hadn't seen for ever so long. She said to me, 'Come along round behind the rock, there, and look at the moonlight on the water.' At first I just yawned, and said, 'No, I'm too tired, and I'm quite happy where I am, thank you.' She swore there'd never been anything like it in the way of moonlight. 'I've heard that tale before,' I said to her. You see, I knew quite well what she was after." Odette narrated this episode almost as if it were a joke, either because it appeared to her to be quite natural, or because she thought that she was thereby minimizing its importance, or else so as not to appear ashamed. But catching sight of Swann's face, she changed her tone, and, "You are a fiend," she flung at him. "You enjoyed tormenting me, making me tell you lies, just so that you'll leave me in peace." This second blow struck at Swann was even more excruciating than the first. Never had he supposed it to have been so recent an affair, hidden from his eyes that had been too innocent to discern it, not in a past which he had never known, but in evenings which he so well remembered, which he had lived through with Odette, of which he had supposed himself to have such an intimate, such an exhaustive knowledge, and which now assumed, retrospectively, an aspect of cunning and deceit and cruelty. In the midst of them parted, suddenly, a gaping chasm, that moment on the island in the Bois de Boulogne. Without being intelligent, Odette had the charm of being natural. She had recounted, she had acted the little scene with so much simplicity that Swann, as he gasped for breath, could vividly see it. Odette yawning, the rock there. He could hear her answer, "Alas, how light-heartedly, I've heard that tale before." He felt that she would tell him nothing more that evening, that no further revelation was to be expected for the present. He was silent for a time, then said to her, "My poor darling, you must forgive me. I know, I am hurting you dreadfully, but it's all over now. I shall never think of it again." But she saw that his eyes remained fixed upon the things that he did not know, and on that past era of their love, monotonous and soothing in his memory because it was vague, and now rent, as with a sword wound, by the news of that minute on the island in the Bois, by moonlight, while he was dining with the Princess des Lames. But he had so far acquired the habit of finding life interesting, of marveling at the strange discoveries that there were to be made in it, that even while he was suffering so acutely that he did not believe it possible to endure such agony for any length of time, he was saying to himself, "Life is indeed astonishing, and holds some fine surprises. It appears that vice is far more common than one has been led to believe. Here is a woman in whom I had absolute confidence, who looks so simple, so honest, who, in any case, even allowing that her morals are not strict, seemed quite normal and healthy in her tastes and inclinations. I receive a most improbable accusation. I question her, and the little that she admits reveals far more than I could ever have suspected." But he could not confine himself to these detached observations. He sought to form an exact estimate of the importance of what she had just told him, so as to know whether he might conclude that she had done these things often, and was likely to do them again. He repeated her words to himself. "I knew quite well what she was after. 2 or 3 times, I've heard that tale before." But they did not reappear in his memory unarmed. Each of them held a knife with which it stabbed him afresh. For a long time, like a sick man who cannot restrain himself from attempting, every minute, to make the movement that, he knows, will hurt him, he kept on murmuring to himself, "I'm quite happy where I am, thank you, I've heard that tale before," but the pain was so intense that he was obliged to stop. He was amazed to find that actions which he had always, hitherto, judged so lightly, had dismissed, indeed, with a laugh, should have become as serious to him as a disease which might easily prove fatal. He knew any number of women whom he could ask to keep an eye on Odette, but how was he to expect them to adjust themselves to his new point of view, and not to remain at that which for so long had been his own, which had always guided him in his voluptuous existence? Not to say to him with a smile, "You jealous monster, wanting to rob other people of their pleasure." By what trap door, suddenly lowered, had he, who had never found, in the old days, in his love for Odette, any but the most refined of pleasures, been precipitated into this new circle of hell from which he could not see how he was ever to escape? Poor Odette! He wished her no harm. She was but half to blame. Had he not been told that it was her own mother who had sold her, when she was still little more than a child, at Nice, to a wealthy Englishman? But what an agonizing truth was now contained for him in those lines of Alfred de Vigny's Journal d'une Poète which he had previously read without emotion. When one feels oneself smitten by love for a woman, one ought to say to oneself, what are her surroundings? What has been her life? All one's future happiness lies in the answer. Swann was astonished that such simple phrases, spelt over in his mind as, "I've heard that tale before," or, "I knew quite well what she was after," could cause him so much pain. But he realized that what he had mistaken for simple phrases were indeed parts of the panoply which held and could inflict on him the anguish that he had felt while Odette was telling her story. For it was the same anguish that he now was feeling afresh. It was no good, his knowing now, indeed, it was no good, as time went on, his having partly forgotten and altogether forgiven the offense. Whenever he repeated her words, his old anguish refashioned him as he had been before Odette began to speak. Ignorant, trustful. His merciless jealousy placed him once again, so that he might be effectively wounded by Odette's admission, in the position of a man who does not yet know the truth. And after several months this old story would still dumbfounder him, like a sudden revelation. He marveled at the terrible recreative power of his memory. It was only by the weakening of that generative force, whose fecundity diminishes as age creeps over one, that he could hope for a relaxation of his torments. But, as soon as the power that any one of Odette's sentences had to make Swann suffer seemed to be nearly exhausted, lo and behold another, one of those to which he had hitherto paid least attention, almost a new sentence, came to relieve the first, and to strike at him with undiminished force. The memory of the evening on which he had dined with the Princess des Lames was painful to him, but it was no more than the center, the core of his pain. That radiated vaguely round about it, overflowing into all the preceding and following days. And on whatever point in it he might intend his memory to rest, it was the whole of that season, during which the Verdurins had so often gone to dine upon the island in the Bois, that sprang back to hurt him so violently that by slow degrees the curiosity which his jealousy was ever exciting in him was neutralized by his fear of the fresh tortures which he would be inflicting upon himself were he to satisfy it. He recognized that all the period of Odette's life which had elapsed before she first met him, a period of which he had never sought to form any picture in his mind, was not the featureless abstraction which he could vaguely see, but had consisted of so many definite, dated years, each crowded with concrete incidents. But were he to learn more of them, he feared lest her past, now colorless, fluid and supportable, might assume a tangible, an obscene form, with individual and diabolical features. And he continued to refrain from seeking a conception of it, not any longer now from laziness of mind, but from fear of suffering. He hoped that, someday, he might be able to hear the island in the Bois, or the Princess des Lames mentioned without feeling any twinge of that old rending pain. Meanwhile he thought it imprudent to provoke Odette into furnishing him with fresh sentences, with the names of more places and people and of different events, which, when his malady was still scarcely healed, would make it break out again in another form. But, often enough, the things that he did not know, that he dreaded, now, to learn, it was Odette herself who, spontaneously and without thought of what she did, revealed them to him. For the gap which her vices made between her actual life and the comparatively innocent life which Swann had believed, and often still believed his mistress to lead, was far wider than she knew. A vicious person, always affecting the same air of virtue before people whom he is anxious to keep from having any suspicion of his vices, has no register, no gauge at hand from which he may ascertain how far those vices, their continuous growth being imperceptible by himself, have gradually segregated him from the normal ways of life. In the course of their cohabitation, in Odette's mind, with the memory of those of her actions which she concealed from Swann, her innocuous actions were gradually colored, infected by these, without her being able to detect anything strange in them, without their causing any explosion in the particular region of herself in which she made them live. But when she related them to Swann, he was overwhelmed by the revelation of the duplicity to which they pointed. One day, he was trying, without hurting Odette, to discover from her whether she had ever had any dealings with procuresses. He was, as a matter of fact, convinced that she had not. The anonymous letter had put the idea into his mind, but in a purely mechanical way. It had been received there with no credulity, but it had, for all that, remained there, and Swann, wishing to be rid of the burden, a dead weight, but none the less disturbing, of this suspicion, hoped that Odette would now extirpate it forever. Oh dear, no. Not that they don't simply persecute me to go to them. Her smile revealed a gratified vanity which she no longer saw that it was impossible should appear legitimate to Swann. There was one of them waited more than 2 hours for me yesterday, said she would give me any money I asked. It seems, there's an ambassador who said to her, I'll kill myself if you don't bring her to me, meaning me. They told her I'd gone out, but she waited, and in the end I had to go myself and speak to her, before she'd go away. I do wish you could have seen the way I tackled her. My maid was in the next room, listening, and told me I shouted fit to bring the house down. But when you hear me say that I don't want to. The idea of such a thing, I don't like it at all. I should hope I'm still free to do as I please and when I please and where I please. If I needed the money, I could understand. The porter has orders not to let her in again. He will tell her that I am out of town. Oh, I do wish I could have had you hidden somewhere in the room while I was talking to her. I know, you'd have been pleased, my dear. There's some good in your little Odette, you see, after all, though people do say such dreadful things about her. Besides, her very admissions, when she made any, of faults which she supposed him to have discovered, rather served Swann as a starting point for fresh doubts than they put an end to the old. For her admissions never exactly coincided with his doubts. In vain might Odette expurgate her confession of all its essential part. There would remain in the accessories something which Swann had never yet imagined, which crushed him anew, and was to enable him to alter the terms of the problem of his jealousy. And these admissions he could never forget. His spirit carried them along, cast them aside, then cradled them again in its bosom, like corpses in a river. And they poisoned it. She spoke to him once of a visit that Forcheville had paid her on the day of the Paris Merci fête. What? You knew him as long ago as that? Oh, yes, of course you did. He corrected himself, so as not to show that he had been ignorant of the fact. And suddenly he began to tremble at the thought that, on the day of the Paris Merci fête, when he had received that letter which he had so carefully preserved, she had been having luncheon, perhaps, with Forcheville at the Maison d'Or. She swore that she had not. Still, the Maison d'Or reminds me of something or other which, I knew at the time, wasn't true, he pursued, hoping to frighten her. Yes, that I hadn't been there at all that evening when I told you I had just come from there, and you had been looking for me at Prévost's, she replied, judging by his manner that he knew, with a firmness that was based not so much upon cynicism as upon timidity, a fear of crossing Swann, which her own self-respect made her anxious to conceal, and a desire to show him that she could be perfectly frank if she chose. And so she struck him with all the sharpness and force of a headsman wielding his axe, and yet could not be charged with cruelty, since she was quite unconscious of hurting him. She even began to laugh, though this may perhaps, it is true, have been chiefly to keep him from thinking that she was ashamed, at all, or confused. It's quite true, I hadn't been to the Maison d'Or. I was coming away from Forcheville's. I had, really, been to Prévost's, that wasn't a story, and he met me there and asked me to come in and look at his prints. But someone else came to see him. I told you that I was coming from the Maison d'Or because I was afraid you might be angry with me. It was rather nice of me, really, don't you see? I admit, I did wrong, but at least I'm telling you all about it now, and what have I to gain by not telling you, straight, that I lunched with him on the day of the Paris Merci fête, if it were true? Especially as at that time we didn't know one another quite so well as we do now, did we, dear? He smiled back at her with the sudden, craven weakness of the utterly spiritless creature which these crushing words had made of him. And so, even in the months of which he had never dared to think again, because they had been too happy, in those months when she had loved him, she was already lying to him. Besides that moment, that first evening on which they had done a catelia, when she had told him that she was coming from the Maison d'Or, how many others must there have been, each of them covering a falsehood of which Swann had had no suspicion. He recalled how she had said to him once, I need only tell me, Verdurin, that my dress wasn't ready, or that my cab came late. There is always some excuse. From himself too, probably, many times when she had glibly uttered such words as explain a delay or justify an alteration of the hour fixed for a meeting. Those moments must have hidden, without his having the least inkling of it at the time, an engagement that she had had with some other man, some man to whom she had said, I need only tell Swann that my dress wasn't ready, or that my cab came late. There is always some excuse. And beneath all his most pleasant memories, beneath the simplest words that Odette had ever spoken to him in those old days, words which he had believed as though they were the words of a gospel, beneath her daily actions which she had recounted to him, beneath the most ordinary places, her dressmaker's flat, the Avenue du Bois, the Hippodrome, he could feel dissembled there, by virtue of that temporal superfluity which, after the most detailed account of how a day has been spent, always leaves something over. That may serve as a hiding place for certain unconfessed actions. He could feel the insinuation of a possible undercurrent of falsehood which debased for him all that had remained most precious. His happiest evenings, the Rue La Pérouse itself, which Odette must constantly have been leaving at other hours than those of which she told him, extending the power of the dark horror that had gripped him when he had heard her admission with regard to the Maison Dorée, and, like the obscene creatures in the desolation of Nineveh, shattering, stone by stone. If, now, he turned aside whenever his memory repeated the cruel name of the Maison Dorée, it was because that name recalled to him, no longer, as, such a little time since, at me, de Saint-Euverte's party, the good fortune which he long had lost, but a misfortune of which he was now first aware. Then it befell the Maison Dorée, as it had befallen the island in the Bois, that gradually its name ceased to trouble him. For what we suppose to be our love, our jealousy are, neither of them, single, continuous and individual passions. They are composed of an infinity of successive loves, of different jealousies, each of which is ephemeral, although by their uninterrupted multitude they give us the impression of continuity, the illusion of unity. The life of Swann's love, the fidelity of his jealousy, were formed out of death, of infidelity, of innumerable desires, innumerable doubts, all of which had Odette for their object. If he had remained for any length of time without seeing her, those that died would not have been replaced by others. But the presence of Odette continued to sow in Swann's heart alternate seeds of love and suspicion. On certain evenings she would suddenly resume towards him a kindness of which she would warn him sternly that he must take immediate advantage, under penalty of not seeing it repeated for years to come. He must instantly accompany her home, to do a catolia, and the desire which she pretended to have for him was so sudden, so inexplicable, so imperious, the kisses which she lavished on him were so demonstrative and so unfamiliar, that this brutal and unnatural fondness made Swann just as unhappy as any lie or unkind action. One evening when he had thus, in obedience to her command, gone home with her, and while she was interspersing her kisses with passionate words, in strange contrast to her habitual coldness, he thought suddenly that he heard a sound. He rose, searched everywhere and found nobody, but he had not the courage to return to his place by her side. Whereupon she, in a towering rage, broke a vase, with, "I never can do anything right with you, you impossible person." And he was left uncertain whether she had not actually had some man concealed in the room, whose jealousy she had wished to wound, or else to inflame his senses. Sometimes he repaired to gay houses, hoping to learn something about Odette, although he dared not mention her name. "I have a little thing here, you're sure to like," the manageress would greet him, and he would stay for an hour or so, talking dolefully to some poor girl who sat there astonished that he went no further. One of them, who was still quite young and attractive, said to him once, "Of course, what I should like would be to find a real friend, then he might be quite certain I should never go with any other men again." Indeed, do you think it possible for a woman really to be touched by a man's being in love with her, and never to be unfaithful to him? Asked Swann anxiously. Why, surely. It all depends on their characters. Swann could not help making the same remarks to these girls as would have delighted the Princess des Lames. To the one who was in search of a friend he said, with a smile, "But how nice of you, you've put on blue eyes to go with your sash. And you too, you've got blue cuffs on. What a charming conversation we are having, for a place of this sort. I'm not boring you, am I? Or keeping you? No, I've nothing to do, thank you. If you bored me I should say so. But I love hearing you talk. I am highly flattered. Aren't we behaving prettily?" he asked the manageress, who had just looked in. "Why, yes, that's just what I was saying to myself. How sensibly they're behaving. But that's how it is. People come to my house now, just to talk. The prince was telling me, only the other day, that he's far more comfortable here than with his wife. It seems that, nowadays, all the society ladies are like that. A perfect scandal, I call it. But I'll leave you in peace now, I know when I'm not wanted," she ended discreetly, and left Swann with the girl who had the blue eyes. But presently he rose and said goodbye to her. She had ceased to interest him. She did not know Odette. The painter having been ill, drive. Cottard recommended a sea voyage. Several of the faithful spoke of accompanying him. The Verdurins could not face the prospect of being left alone in Paris, so first of all hired, and finally purchased a yacht. Thus Odette was constantly going on a cruise. Whenever she had been away for any length of time, Swann would feel that he was beginning to detach himself from her, but, as though this moral distance were proportionate to the physical distance between them, whenever he heard that Odette had returned to Paris, he could not rest without seeing her. Once, when they had gone away, as everyone thought, for a month only, either they succumbed to a series of temptations, or else M. Verdurin had cunningly arranged everything beforehand, to please his wife, and disclosed his plans to the faithful, only as time went on. Anyhow, from Algiers they flitted to Tunis, then to Italy, Greece, Constantinople, Asia Minor. They had been absent for nearly a year, and Swann felt perfectly at ease and almost happy. Albeit M. Verdurin had endeavored to persuade the pianist and doctor Cottard that their respective aunt and patients had no need of them, and that, in any event, it was most rash to allow me Cottard to return to Paris, where, me. Verdurin assured him, a revolution had just broken out. He was obliged to grant them their liberty at Constantinople. And the painter came home with them. One day, shortly after the return of these four travelers, Swann, seeing an omnibus approach him, labeled Luxembourg, and having some business there, had jumped onto it and had found himself sitting opposite me. Cottard, who was paying a round of visits to people whose day it was, in full review order, with a plume in her hat, a silk dress, a muff, an umbrella, which would do for a parasol if the rain kept off, a card case, and a pair of white gloves fresh from the cleaners. Wearing these badges of rank, she would, in fine weather, go on foot from one house to another in the same neighborhood, but when she had to proceed to another district, would make use of a transfer ticket on the omnibus. For the first minute or two, until the natural courtesy of the woman broke through the starched surface of the doctor's wife, not being certain, either, whether she ought to mention the Verdurins before Swann, she produced, quite naturally, in her slow and awkward, but not unattractive voice, which, every now and then, was completely drowned by the rattling of the omnibus, topics selected from those which she had picked up and would repeat in each of the score of houses up the stairs of which she clambered in the course of an afternoon. I needn't ask you, M. Swann, whether a man so much in the movement as yourself has been to the Merletons to see the portrait by Mochard that the whole of Paris is running after. Well, and what do you think of it? Whose camp are you in, those who bless or those who curse? It's the same in every house in Paris now. No one will speak of anything else but Mochard's portrait. You aren't smart, you aren't really cultured, you aren't up to date unless you give an opinion on Mochard's portrait. Swann having replied that he had not seen this portrait, me. Cottard was afraid that she might have hurt his feelings by obliging him to confess the omission. Oh, that's quite all right. At least you have the courage to be quite frank about it. You don't consider yourself disgraced because you haven't seen Mochard's portrait. I do think that's so nice of you. Well now, I have seen it. Opinion is divided, you know. There are some people who find it rather labored, like whipped cream, they say. But I think it's just ideal. Of course, she's not a bit like the blue and yellow ladies that our friend Biche paints. That's quite clear. But I must tell you, perfectly frankly, you'll think me dreadfully old-fashioned, but I always say just what I think, that I don't understand his work. I can quite see the good points there are in his portrait of my husband. Oh, dear me, yes. And it's certainly less odd than most of what he does, but even then he had to give the poor man a blue mustache. But Mochard. Just listen to this now, the husband of my friend, I am on my way to see at this very moment, which has given me the very great pleasure of your company, has promised her that, if he is elected to the Academy, he is one of the doctor's colleagues, he will get Mochard to paint her portrait. So she's got something to look forward to. I have another friend who insists that she'd rather have Leloir. I'm only a wretched Philistine, and I've no doubt Leloir has perhaps more knowledge of painting even than Machard. But I do think that the most important thing about a portrait, especially when it's going to cost 10,000 francs, is that it should be like, and a pleasant likeness, if you know what I mean.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.